From the Flint Hills Writing Project, this is The Suggestion Box, where teachers get ideas. I'm your host, Andrea Marshbank. Today we're here with Hannah Waldy, an English teacher at an alternative school, and she's going to share with us one of her favorite things that she does in the classrooms to suggest to all of the teachers out there. It is an idea that can be applied to any classroom, not just English, not just math, not just secondary. Definitely, this is one for you out there, elementary school teachers. It's an idea that has actually impacted me pretty heavily personally, so we'll get into all of that, and we're going to roll right into the interview. We're so happy to have you here today, Hannah.
Hello.
Can you tell us what your special idea is?
It's the idea of mindfulness, and it's not really my idea. A lot of people practice it. There are whole schools that use it. I just happened upon it, so I can't really claim it like as it was my original idea, but I do use it quite a bit.
That's a fair kind of...
I didn't want to claim it like I was the originator. That's so not true.
Yeah, there's a lot of background.
Yeah, there is.
So how did you specifically come onto the idea of mindfulness?
I think the way that I stumbled upon it was like this timely, convergence between using it in my personal life and then realizing that it had some application in the classroom. So I was struggling in the classroom at the time, not with my students or material or anything. I think it was just that feeling of having some students with these huge life challenges, high poverty rates, a lot of stress in their lives, and just feeling like I know that the power of reading and writing matters and can be transformative, but how do I make them understand that when they didn't have breakfast that morning and they're not sure, where they're going to sleep that night, or these terrible things going on in their lives? And I kept struggling with, okay, I either have to fix their lives for them or I have to abandon ship or something. And then I guess I realized I had been using a little bit of meditation in my personal life, and I don't know, really, there was no major epiphany, just that one day I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder if this would work in the classroom to kind of give my kids just a little mental break from all the crap that's going on.
Yeah.
So I started testing it out just as like these little brief, minute or two. I didn't even call it mindfulness or anything like that. I just said it was like quiet time, and they were just to kind of think and be still. So it started off really small.
So when you're saying mindfulness, because my interpretation of mindfulness, and maybe some of our viewers aren't super familiar, is it's something like, when I think of mindfulness, I think of my own meditations. Like, I have an app that I use called Headspace, where I plug in my earphones and I focus a lot on breathing and visualization. Is that the mindfulness that you use?
Oh yeah, but I think you could tailor it. I mean, it's definitely not. I think sometimes people aren't really sure what that term means, and then if you say meditation, then I think sometimes people get a little nervous, like maybe there's supposed to be a spiritual component, and there definitely could be in your personal life. Or, I mean, if you were in a religious school setting, there could be. I think prayer, if you think about like prayer that takes place in a Catholic school or some kind of religious school, that could be considered mindfulness. Anytime you're kind of stilling your body and trying to either think about one thing or maybe not think about anything and focus on breathing. I don't think it has to look any certain way. It can include meditation, but I think it could look pretty different in a lot of different settings.
Yeah. So keeping in mind the varieties of mindfulness, and that this may not be, the most accurate definition, but for your definition, if you had to define mindfulness in a sentence, what would it be?
That's a good question. In relation to my classroom, it would be giving the students a little bit of structured, guided time in which, maybe there's no electronics. There might be some quiet music. There might be some instructions about breathing techniques, and just allowing their mind, trying to help them figure out how to be still for a little bit. And then maybe if they get practiced at it, and this is like I still don't do this very well sometimes, but I think when you get skilled at it, you figure out like how to separate some of those really nagging thoughts, even in super stressful times.
So a moment of mental calm.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be, we're so busy in our classrooms. It doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be at any certain time. I had been doing it mostly at the beginning of class, kind of setting the tone. But I think you could experiment with it anytime.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
What does that look like at the beginning of class when you do it to set the tone? Like, how do you have music going? Do you tell the kids, all right, we're going to close our eyes? Where are you at?
I'm still experimenting. I wish I could say like, oh, I've tried it out and I've perfected it and here's my formula, but that's not all the case. I have high schoolers, and sometimes cell phones can be a battle, like please put them away just for a little bit. Usually what I do is I have this room with all these great windows, so I lower all the blinds, and I have a couple lamps that I use instead of the overhead fluorescent lighting. So I usually have the lamps on. And then it kind of depends on, I get some kids that really like certain sounds. They'll be like, we love that ocean. And I just end up on YouTube like half the time. Just, okay, I'm going to research, not research. I'm going to play like a rain soundtrack because it's kind of rainy outside anyway. We usually just start off at the beginning of the semester with, all I need you to do is be still. You don't have to close your eyes. Find a comfy spot. I've got some yoga balls and some yoga mats and carpet. I've got a rug so they can lay down or they can sit in their chair just like normal, and just to kind of be quiet and not be actively doing anything. And then I try as time goes by to notice like I'll ask them for suggestions of what kind of sounds they find soothing, and I get kids who recommend wonderful things. Sometimes you have to listen to it first. Like a student sent me one, and it was these great sounds of nature, and we're all like into it, and there were these flutes in the background, and then there was this horrible bird like squawking super loud. So that one I should have previewed first, but and then as time goes on, I'll try to encourage them, like maybe just to I'll say something like, hey, if you're getting distracted, because I do all the time, you might try counting your breaths, like 1 in, out, in and out 1, and then 2, and you could go up to 7. You could not count at all and just think about the breathing. There's not any, I think if you present it to them like there's a right or wrong way, you're missing the boat on mindfulness, because most meditation encourages you to kind of meet yourself where you're at, and just if you get distracted, go back to your breathing. That's the big. So I do try to encourage them to think about their breathing and maybe think about what they're feeling, but with no judgment, like just, I'm kind of tired. Not good or bad, it's just where I'm at. So yeah, I feel like that was a really long answer to your question, so.
You're fine. I think it's interesting that you bring up how students self-reflect and say, I'm tired, or I'm not feeling so great, but rather than, because mindfulness is not an act of fixing it. So rather than them trying to solve that immediately, it's more of an acknowledgement of what is. Do students have the recognition that that's what they're doing? How do you tell them that that's part of it?
I've gotten better about that. I think when I was first doing it, I was just like, okay, we're doing a mindfulness. I would call it a mindfulness, or I'd say it was a relaxation journal. I thought that made it sound appealing. And then what their goal is to relax for a while, practice some mindfulness, whether they knew it or not, and then to write in their journal. And so it was still kind of geared toward like that beginning of class structure. But then I think they got it more when I went into more of an explanation about why we did it, not just because Ms. Waldy doesn't want to fill that journal space on Tuesday or whatever. And we talked a lot about that these major performers and CEOs and people that are under a great deal of pressure practice mindfulness to cope. It's a really, I try to highlight like sports stars that I know have talked about using it, because it's used all over the place. It's not just some hippy dippy thing that I brought in. And I think they get it sometimes when we talk about that.
So have you had students be distracted during these moments?
God, yes.
Can you give us some examples?
Well, farting happens, it's like every semester some kid I'm like, really, you couldn't have just walked into the hall? One of the kids said, well, I could have, but I was so relaxed. I was like, oh my gosh. Oh yeah, they get distracted. And sometimes I've had like some of my younger groups, because I have such a wide range of ages that I teach at my school. So sometimes the younger kids seem to struggle with it a little bit more. They're not as mature, so they'll get real giggly. And so sometimes I will, just like I would with any other activity in class, I'll go over the expectations. Like, okay, we kind of seemed to struggle last week. Remember, you don't have to close your eyes. You don't have to, do anything, but you can't distract your neighbor, because I'll have kids that will do that. So yeah, it is such an imperfect activity. But I do feel like as the semester goes on, there was one class one time where I felt like they were struggling with it so much, and I was kind of discouraged, and I went to take it out, and I told them, it's like, I just don't think we can handle doing this right now. We're not going to do this anymore.
Right.
That's always an option. But the thing with that class was they like begged for it to stay, and then kind of fixed. I mean, I don't think they were like expert meditators by the end of that, but they wanted it. So they were able to kind of turn it around, and we kept it as a routine. So
that's awesome. That's
yeah,
really cool.
I've threatened to pull it though.
It's great that they had such a positive response to it.
Well, I think that, I don't know if they're able to verbalize this sometimes, but I think I've had a couple of, pretty, I don't know, astute students who will recognize what's going on. But I think sometimes the way they say it is just like, oh man, yeah, I never get a chance to relax. And they probably do and aren't able to use the time for that because of, there's so many distractions. We're such a busy world. But I think sometimes they do appreciate, even if it's just a few minutes of, I just want you to be still. And some of them think about some weird stuff. I had a kid that always wrote about, he was always writing about pie after the relaxation time. And I was like, God, this kid, I think at one point I brought him some pie because it was like, oh, well, this is where your mind is, but that's okay. I mean, it wasn't, there's nothing wrong with that. Just some time to relax. And then maybe the class period feels a little less stressful. I don't know. I need to do better. I need to find a way to gather some data on what class periods look like after that. I know that some of the schools that practice mindfulness, like as a school,
right?
There's some in California. They're all over, but I know some schools have it as a very structured, like this is what their school is using, kind of as a discipline technique to reduce,
like preventative.
Yes.
Okay.
So I can't think of it off the top of my head, but if you Google, you can find these schools. I think there's on mindfulness.org. I should probably verify that, but that they have that as a school-wide approach and speak very highly of it, and they have really structured ways that they do it. So I know that the kids get very accustomed to it being part of a routine, and I think that's a wonderful idea. I don't know. I looked into you can be trained, and it was kind of expensive, and at the time I was toying with a bunch of different ideas, and I should probably look at it again, but it was one of those I thought, oh man, this I think would be really cool to pursue as a school. Some of the mindfulness that's being practiced in schools, they are using it in schools that had this huge need for kids to learn how to self-regulate, and that's a extremely valuable skill that you can use for the rest of your life in so many different situations, not just school.
Have you ever had any of your students come back to you and say, Ms. Waldy, I tried this when I was having a bad day and it helped, or it didn't make things worse?
Off the top of my head, I don't know that I've had someone come back and talk about it, but I did. I had a young man in my class, and I had him 2 hours in a row, and I was kind of like, you see a kid's name on your roster, and you're like, oh, okay, all right. And then I saw his name twice. I was like, oh my God,
oh, no.
I have him 2 hours in a row. And I'd had brief interaction with him in the hall, and knew from other teachers that he was kind of a handful.
Mm-hmm.
There was just a lot of vulgar, I just thought, oh, this is gonna be really interesting. So I had him first thing in the morning, 2 hours in a row. And when we started doing the mindfulness stuff, he at first thought it was kind of weird. He was like, wait, you just want us to sit here? And I'm like, well, kind of. And then when we got into it, it wasn't maybe 2 or 3 weeks in. He said something about where were you my freshman year of high school? And I was like, I don't know where this conversation's going. I was here. And he had gone to a different school because I'm at an alternative school. So we usually get kids after they've not been successful their freshman year. And I said, well, I was here. What do you mean? And he said, man, I was really, I had a really hard time. I was a jerk and I was kind of out of control, and I think this would have helped. Like, he wasn't signing up for yoga classes or, really deep into meditation, but I think and granted, he was a senior, I think he understood that little bit of relaxing and then kind of processing the relaxing through their writing was helpful. So that was really powerful.
Yeah. Absolutely. To get that affirmation that it had meant something to him, for sure. Do you feel like this could apply to younger classrooms? Or you said you do this with freshmen, and then he was also a senior.
I think I had him in an elective, but actually, I know this seems strange, but in our school, since so much of what we're helping kids do is catch up on credits, I had him for an elective, and he had flunked this one semester of English 9. So my English 9 course is a wide range of ages. There's some kind of traditional age. Maybe they're transferring right after first semester that they didn't do well. But he was one that just needed that kind of credit that was out there. So he was a senior. He was about to graduate. But he was in English 9, and I believe it was creative writing. So
yeah,
I do think that it would be good for any age. And part of why I think that is, I think you could do some of the more, I want to say creative, but I don't know if that's the right word. I think you could do some of those more riskier activities. And what I mean by risky is, like, if I asked my maybe kind of jaded seniors who are like ready to go out in the world to, I don't know, picture themselves in a meadow of flowers, they're going to be like, okay, no. But I think if you asked a 5-year-old, if you have a kindergartner, they're so open.
They'd get into that.
That I think you could really use the mindfulness in so many powerful ways, both for reducing anxiety, but also, maybe for channeling some of their creativity into projects that you have going on in the classroom. They're just so much more pliable with what you ask them to do than a 18-year-old who's got a job in an apartment and is like, I'm not picturing a meadow of flowers. It's not happening.
Yeah, the visualization might go.
I think I usually just ask them, when we've done kind of really small jumps into visualization, it's more like just picturing something very peaceful. But I think with the younger crowd, oh my God, they already picture a lot of really cool stuff. So I think you could use that to your advantage.
Just to take a hold of their imagination.
Yeah, and I think sometimes I think anyone who teaches elementary school already knows this, but I think we still have this idea that elementary school students aren't stressed, and that's not true. We've got, a lot of societal struggles that are going on, and our kids feel that. I don't think sometimes they know how to verbalize it. And I think teaching them a skill that could help them deal with stress, even if a kid comes from an ideal family, they might be stressed about a sport or a test that they're taking, and definitely are at-risk youth who are stressed with much bigger struggles. I think that's a valuable skill for them to have. So
yeah, I think I completely agree. It's really inspirational to think that if we could teach mindfulness to our younger kids, it could help them as this life skill all throughout. And I feel the world of education, has been very into social and emotional learning lately, and this seems to slide right into that. Yeah, just another tool in the toolbox to pull out when you're having a really rough time.
I also think that sometimes you hear, usually it's kind of in a joking way, but sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, I wish I would have learned that in school. And sometimes they're talking about their taxes or whatever. And I really think that that's a skill that if we gave it to our kids from a young age, they'd be so accustomed to practicing it by the time they got to middle and high school when we have them, that I think it would just be second nature. And I think it'd be one of those things they take away from school being like, I'm really glad that school taught me this, as opposed to, a lot of the things that I'm sure I teach that they're like, I don't know why we learned that. But
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the immediate relevance, especially with like what you were talking about when you explained it to them a little bit more.
I also think then you can get to the stuff that, so if you've got a kiddo that's, for whatever reason, got some major stresses in life and you're trying to teach whatever it is, whatever your content is, I think you're a lot more likely to get them to the point where they can learn it if you can reduce that stress like at the get-go.
Do you think there's any benefit to you like acknowledging that they have very valid stress right at the beginning? Because when you do this practice, it sounds like you're inviting a conversation of your lives are very busy. If nothing else, they're at least busy.
Maybe it's the setting that I'm in. Since I'm in a alternative school, I think that all of our staff are really good about honesty, about like acknowledging, hey, for most of our kids, they're there for a reason. And whether it was, they had a child and they need daycare for the child so they can graduate, or they have, I have kids that are on their own. Their family situation was not such that they could stay, and they're, for all practical purposes, adults. I've got kids dealing with things I never had to deal with, and I think when they talk about their lives, it's really easy, I think, to get caught up in that like sort of feeling sorry for them and then kind of bemoaning, oh, the world, like we need to, but this is like a really small, easy, free, practical tool that I feel like I can give them that makes me feel a little more powerful in giving it to them, but I hope gives them a sense that, okay, I've got some little bit of control, because a lot of them have control over virtually nothing that's going on in their world.
So when you are going through the preparations to do a mindfulness practice or a reflective journal activity in your class, what kind of things do you pull out? Do you use, you talked about YouTube videos and maybe a little bit of images, like, or sounds, was it?
Oh, yeah.
So what kind of things do you go for that, like, our listeners, if they were interested in practicing mindfulness, like, what could they look at?
I think you can start off really simple with virtually no supplies. It is one of those things where I think you could just go in and your kids. I mean, I usually wait, not too far into the school year, but maybe a week or two, kind of get to know my kids. I have a really small student body that I work with, so that's a quicker process for me, but I do get a lot of new kids. But I think once you get to know them, just picking some sounds, whether that has, I know my kids have been big fans of like Native American flutes, and ocean sounds are always a big winner. I think the rain, any kind of rain soundtrack, my kids were always like, yes. And then you can branch out. And I did try a few that I was like, oh my God, that was so not relaxing, and just never used it again. And then I asked for suggestions from kids, which again worked sometimes. Like one kid gave me this white noise soundtrack, and I was like, it just sounds like static. And he was the only fan of it that hour. He was like, yeah, this is awesome. And all the kids were like, do you have it on? Is this even working right? But then if if you're comfortable, you can, I think, branch out a little. You can, or a lot. There's guided meditations. Sometimes those my kids get to giggling at those, it seems like, because the people get kind of corny. And if you meditate, I think those are helpful, but sometimes my students are like, why does this person sound so weird?
Yeah. Kind of like a Batman going on.
And they often have like accents, which are awesome, but my kids will get really distracted and then try to imitate them. And I just found, for the most part, the guided ones, unless they were super short and just really straightforward, like not picturing a lot of light coming from your body or anything, because my kids always took that to the bad place. If they were really straightforward and simple, the guided ones worked. There are great apps out there. There's all kinds of materials you can get. I did come across, and I mean, not to plug anyone for any purpose, but like most people that are have done any work with meditation or even just a tiny bit of research, Jon Kabat-Zinn is a big name. And I did find a lot of his, when I was kind of trying to justify it to myself, sort of, as using time in the classroom for it, I did find so much of his material helpful in kind of understanding the basics of why this is such a valid practice. But I think you could go with anything. I mean, anything that works. I wouldn't pay for anything. I mean, most teachers, unless you're like a rich teacher? Does that even exist?
Oxymoron.
Wait, no? Okay, so the one of you.
The one of you that is a rich
like
teacher.
Inherited. You have a trust fund, but you're also a teacher. I just can't see, like, I was able to order some materials that were paid for by someone else, and I did, but I think you could just use the free stuff and it would be totally fine.
Yeah. We were actually talking about, before we turned on the microphones, ASMR recordings. And Hannah was not into it, but for listeners, for those of you who don't know what ASMR is, it's a wormhole that's going to eat you in YouTube if you ever decide to go down there.
Why will it eat you? I would click on one and get right back out because it sounds horrible.
And so for those of you who don't know, it's this idea that you get very, very close to your microphone, and I'll demonstrate for just a second in just a minute.
No,
and
don't subject them to that.
Then it's just you get very close, and there's some sort of sound. Like some people really are into ASMR sounds where people are like eating pickles. So if you can just imagine the like crunch and mouth noises because you're like this close to your microphone, and it's a very personal experience, and you can hear a lot of saliva. And so I'm over here thinking, like, I want one of your students to bring you an ASMR, because some people, like, that's relaxing to them.
I do remember, okay, this is jogging a memory. You know how forgetful I am. I do remember a student talking about it, and I don't remember that acronym, but I do remember them talking about someone was, like, eating something, and I thought it sounded so repulsive. I don't think he was suggesting it for meditation or relaxation time, but I was also just like horrified at the whole thing. So I kind of walked away and was like, oh,
I'm going to email one of your students and be like, please ask Mrs. Waldy. Ms. Waldy. Oh, every time, guys.
Ms. Waldy will not play it.
Ms. Waldy.
And then I will find you and fight you.
And then kind of bouncing off of what you were talking about, the resources and being expensive, but also the resources you did find really justified your personal experience of this is a useful time in my class. Have you ever had any pushback from either people like admin where that really matters, or even just like from colleagues who are like, what are you guys doing in there?
I would say with 100% certainty that there are many moments when my colleagues say, what are you guys doing in there? Not just with relaxation. I'm really fortunate to be in a school that I think part of it is because it's an alternative school and our administration is very, they really believe that, hey, most of our kids were not successful the first time around. Please don't teach things exactly the same way as they were the first time, because if that was the case, then we could just follow the curriculum exactly like everyone else in the district does. So there is a lot of flexibility with doing things outside the box at my school. I have had my principal walk in several times because he's around and in classrooms a great deal. And since we're a small school, I mean, my classroom's gonna be hit every time. And he'll walk in and I'll say, oh, we're relaxing. And he never does like, why? Or like, why aren't you reading or something? He just like apologizes and closes the door. Like it's not a big deal. I think I did at one time explain to him because I didn't want him to think, why is she always relaxing? Because I would totally do that and just, guys, it's relaxing. Yeah. We're going to relax all hour. Let Miss Waldy nap. But even then he was kind of like, he didn't say this, but I think the message was, I don't know why you're explaining this to me. Like I trust you. I know that not all administration is like that. I know that some teachers, there's a lot of micromanaging that goes on. So I could totally see providing some of that backup information, whether it was from like Mindful Schools or there's so much research out there that supports mindfulness, whether you look up the phrase mindfulness or whether it's under meditation or relaxation techniques. The area, looking it up and applying it to the school is a little bit newer, but it's an older, that if you take it away from the school and just apply it in general, it's been used with, medical patients and, like I said earlier, people that are in powerful positions. So I think that if you really wanted to make the case for your admin, you could. I don't think there would be any, with a really small amount of research. I'm not talking like a dissertation you're going to have to do. I think you could. And I guess if there was still pushback, someone could maybe just incorporate it in smaller bits. Like I know one of the things we do was like the kids would put their hands on the table and we would count in and out for like 5 breaths, and then we'd repeat that a couple times. That could be done in the span of, 30 seconds, and you might find that, oh, okay, we're kind of a little bit calmer or something. So
taking it just like a piece at a time.
Yeah, and I've never done anything. Well, I take that back. When I have senior comp, sometimes when we're doing resumes and talking about how do I send an email that I need to be assertive and yet not sound terrible in, and those kind of things, we do talk a lot about the stresses of being an adult and kind of handling those. So with them, I might spend longer, but with most of my classes, nothing lasts more than 5 minutes tops. So it's not, and that sometimes I say 5 minutes, and I'm also including like journal writing time. So it's not meant to take up a big chunk of time. Sometimes when there's a really stressful outside event, throw a relaxation journal in there unexpectedly. Around the time of the Parkland shooting, when my kids were talking about that and seemed stressed about it, we did, I think, an extra one that week. So, I think you could gauge where your students are at as well and kind of, oh, man, we need just a minute or two to do some deep breathing.
And what a great way to respond if your school had something really unfortunate happen, to acknowledge that we're not ignoring this, but we have to handle our emotions.
Here's what you can control. There's so much you can't, but you can control your body and what you do with your mind, sort of. And this is one tool. It doesn't fix everything. It's not the solution to every problem out there, but I think it's really practical and just can be inserted anywhere and free. It's just one of those things you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know why I've been teaching forever, it seems like, and I just started doing this a few years ago.
It kind of sounds like one of those things. It's like, why isn't everybody
That's exactly. I kept thinking, why didn't I do this before? And why am I not hearing about this just everywhere?
Right.
And I'm not really sure what the answer to that is. I do think part of it is there's sometimes that association, like we talked about earlier, where people assume that it has to take sort of a, religious tone. Absolutely doesn't. I think if we just called it breathing, maybe people would be like, yeah, we're breathing. But then that sounds so simple that you're like, well, okay, what are you learning?
What are the benefits of breathing?
Why are you just breathing in your reading class? My teacher's really into it.
She does it all the time.
She's a big fan.
Yeah. Do you, just kind of bouncing off of your indication that, during the Parkland shootings, this was a way to have a moment of peace in the classroom. Do you think that there's any relationship or potential relationship between mindfulness and meditation and breathing and trauma-informed teaching?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I feel like before the kind of the buzzword or the buzz phrase trauma-informed teaching, I think a lot, especially if you were in a maybe a super high needs school, low SES, that kind of thing, I think you already were kind of doing that. You just didn't know what to call it. I think that when I've gone to our school, I think has had, maybe 5 or 6 trainings that are along those lines. And it comes up and I'm like, yeah, I already do that. I don't want to say I'm a superstar.
But you are.
No, it comes up when they talk about trauma-informed care, trauma-informed teaching, because I think people, I've done the relaxation stuff in class, and occasionally I'll have some of my students go, oh, my therapist told me to do this. And I'm like, oh, yay. And then I'm like, I hope you liked your therapist also. But I think that people that's what they do day in and day out all the time, the trauma-informed care, know that this is super valuable. I think the rest of us are just kind of now, oh yeah, we should use that. Because I don't know that I would have called years ago, or I don't know. I don't know that I would have referred to what I do as trauma-informed care. And now I understand that is some of what I do throughout the day. So I think those people that their label was maybe a therapist or someone that served in a even more high stress situation where that's what people were coming all the time with, was this huge amount of trauma. I think they get it, and they've been doing it for a while.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely. It's we're kind of on the tail end of getting on this really, really helpful train.
Yeah, because I think we're finally maybe starting to understand just how stressed our students are. We looked at one of my classes, we looked at this graph that was talking about when the most stress occurs in life. And I think the students were really surprised that this publication had referred to teenagers being stressed, because I think for a long time in our country, we viewed childhood as just this idyllic, oh, you have no bills and you live at home and you do all these great things. And, you hear people, oh, I'd go back to high school, which P.S. I would not go back to high school. But I think that now we're starting to understand that maybe there are some pretty serious stresses that occur, health problems, mental health struggles, all that. So I think we're just understanding where our kids are a little bit better.
Right. So I'm going to change the direction of our conversation just a little bit, because one time I watched a YouTube video. And are you impressed?
Well, wasn't that awful pickle eating, was it?
No. So John Green, are you familiar with John Green?
The author?
Yes.
Yes.
So he's written, for those of you who are listening who aren't familiar, he's written Looking for Alaska and Paper Towns and Abundance of Catherines, and most recently Turtles All the Way Down, which was very good. Highly recommend it. All of his stuff is just great across the board. And he did a series of videos when he was trying to get in shape. And he made a big point about, like, when he was trying to get in shape, he wanted to do it both mentally and physically. So a lot of it was him working out, and he had a specific name for it. The YouTube video, it's like a channel he made separate from his like vlog brothers, and he did it with his friend, and they went through a lot of workouts and physical training, and they had a lot of doctor care and input. But one of the things they did was mindfulness and meditation, and he was really open about his mental illness. He talked about how he suffers from some OCD and some various other levels of anxiety, and he discussed how mindfulness, he felt like, was actually hurting him. Like throughout the series, he keeps coming back to, like, I'm trying to do this, but when I do it, it makes my thoughts kind of spiral out of control. And it was actually kind of a detriment. And by the end of the series, because there were many videos, I think this was over the course of several months, he had found he had found some solace in it, but I think it took him a long amount of time. So I'm wondering, have you ever had any students who, when you do this, have to, like, it's only for a few minutes, so this might be a different experience than doing it for like 10 to 15 minutes. But have you had any students come to you and say, I can't do this?
No, I've never had any students. I do have some students that I might take them aside and offer suggestions. They seem, maybe they're super energetic, so I'll suggest, hey, you could sit on the yoga ball and then you can quietly roll back and forth or kind of bounce a little, and it's just not distracting to anyone. The music's playing, and that might help you with your energy. I do know I went to a training and she worked a lot with schools, and she did go over some good tips with us that I really hung on to. And one of them was like, never force someone to close their eyes during that activity. There was a gentleman that was in the audience, and I remember thinking, why wouldn't you say, hey, close your eyes? But then this gentleman in the audience spoke up, and he's like, yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. I am a vet. Now, granted, my students aren't going to be vets, but similar trauma. I'm a vet, and closing my eyes can be around other people is very traumatic. I think of all these things. It's kind of a trigger. I've got all this trauma, and I can't do it. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm so glad he spoke up, because I had never, since I'm not coming from that place, I just thought, oh man, you close your eyes, you get rid of some of the distractions around you. I didn't think of it as a struggle. So I always try to emphasize to my kids, like, you don't really even have to participate, in the sense that if you're like, man, by God, I'm going to think about this stressful event, you just go for it. But you do have to just be quiet. I would ask them to do that during a test, though.
Yeah.
So I feel like in a different setting, you would have to be a lot more careful. And if I was, really asking them to, I don't know, let's go back to, if I was like hypnotizing or trying to bring out some suppressed memory. But this is so brief, and it's so, we listen to music in class on a regular basis. Now, granted, I might subject them to, early 90s rap, and they're like, oh my God, what is this? But there's always music playing in the background of my classroom. This is just a little different. And there are times when I expect them to be quiet. Maybe we're doing silent reading or we're taking a test. So I feel like because all those components are going to be in the classroom anyway, I'm just asking them to do it in a little different way. I think if I had a student, well, I don't think, if I ever had a student that came to me and said, I can't focus on my breathing, it makes me think of whatever, I would absolutely just find a different way for them to participate or excuse them or whatever. I would never want it to, it really is just meant to be, let's gather our thoughts and, you know, take a few moments to take some deep breaths and try to put all that stuff that's going on in our life to the side just for, you know, if I can even get a few minutes from them where they can push that aside, I'm happy.
Right.
So,
and it sounds a lot like you're asking them to do as much as is good for them.
Right.
You spoke about earlier in the podcast about meditation. A lot of the concepts behind it are meeting you where you're at. And so maybe that's a part of it.
Absolutely. And I have kids that fall asleep. That always makes me laugh because they're like, what if I fall asleep? I'm like, well, you must have been really relaxed. I'll wake you up and we'll go on. It's not a big deal. I did have a kid one time that fell asleep, and our relaxation, we were just like, I mean, he must have been so tired because it was like 30 seconds in, and he was snoring like a bear. It was so loud. And that relaxation was fun because everyone was giggling, and I was fine with that. We did, you know, we let him snore for a moment, and then I was like, I think I better wake him because, you know, this is kind of distracting. But it ended up being very humorous, and the kids got, instead of maybe getting started on the note that I was set for them to do, which was this calm, peaceful place, that they were in a good mood because his snore was hilarious. So it worked. Yeah. You know, it wasn't bad.
I guess that brings me to a question of like, do you ever, so if you have a student who's distracted, or we've already addressed if they're asleep, your response, but if you have a student who's doing something else, do you ever get angry or where you're like, you were not mindful enough, Johnny?
Oh, in my brain, yes. In my brain, I just want to be like, oh my God, all I'm asking you to do is, you know, sit quietly for a moment and not bug your neighbor. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll suggest, like, I'll try to frame it in a positive manner, like, oh, I had this one little fella and he was just such a busy boy, and he was always he wouldn't say anything. He would just mess with people around him. So I told him I had a special spot for him and I had set up like a couple yoga mats, like one on top of each other, so it was nice and cushiony. I was like, I bring the yoga ball over, whatever you need to do, this is your whole space. And I don't know why he thought that was kind of cool, but he did. He was like, oh, I have like a special space set up. None of you got that. I think everyone else understood why he was going there. But I have had students where I have to, you know, just like anything else you do in your classroom, it gets better with practice sometimes, most of the time. So, yeah, I'm pretty flexible, but I do have to, there's always that one kid that you're like, oh my gosh, I have to go up the expectations for relaxation for the 85th time with you, apparently. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah, for coming on the show today and talking to us about mindfulness. I learned a lot, and I feel like our listeners did as well.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. So to our listeners out there, if you have any suggestions that you would like to share with the world, with our teachers, our listeners, please contact us at thesuggestionboxpodcast.com or email us at thesuggestionboxpodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you just search the Suggestion Box Podcast, we'll pop right up. So we're happy to hear about any lesson plans or units or strategies or techniques that you were just really excited about and think more people should be doing. Special thank you to Krista McGriff, our graphic designer, the directors of the Flint Hills Writing Project, Dr. Roger and Heather Caswell, as well as Sonic Tonic Audio for some of our tunes that we use in this podcast. See you next time.